Okay, so we are here with
Duane Davis.
of Wax Trax.
Of Wax Trax.
Okay. All right, question 1. Introduce yourself and your role in creating Wax Trax.
Again, my name is Duane. I was, in 1978, I was a caseworker with Jefferson County Social Services in a adolescents in crisis unit, and there I met Dave Stedman, who was also a caseworker at Jefferson County, and he and I became friends and talked a lot about music, and eventually we were out at the annual chili and beer bus party put on by Jefferson County Juvenile Probation, and we'd had a couple of beers, and Dave and I are standing there, and he says to me, "Hey, why don't we get a record store?" And I said, "Sure." And so that winter we did. We bought an existing store, which was called Wax Trax Records, from a couple of guys, Jim and Danny, in first week of November of 1978. We took over and opened up the doors for ourselves, and 45 years later, here we are.
When had they opened it?
They had opened it a couple of years in advance of that. They'd been in a different location over off of 14th and Logan, 14th and Ogden, and then had moved into the current location at 13th and Washington at least a year to a year and a half before we took over.
They founded the Chicago branch, right?
They did. They were moving, in fact, because they felt that they needed a bigger population to draw on for the kind of audience that they were appealing to, which was, pretty much the punk, goth, industrial dance crowd that was starting to form in Denver, but was pretty small and would not sustain the kind of operation they were looking at. So they moved to Chicago, and yes, had a great store, and of course had the Wax Trax label, which was a wonderful label with all kinds of bands on it.
Would you say you were left with the more neurotic and interesting crowd?
Well, they were neurotic, and sometimes they were interesting. There was a holdover, of course, of the kids who had been coming in when Jim and Danny had the store, and there was a bit of a transition period since Dave and I were not into particularly a rock and roll lifestyle. We were, ex-social workers. We were kind of calm guys.
Question 2. What's the biggest difference between Denver now and Denver in the 1980s? If you had to say one big difference, what's the big difference?
Well, the biggest difference is there's too many people. It's become so crowded. That's a very complicated question. Just to take one aspect of it would be the internet. It has completely changed not just how people go about their day-to-day lives, but it's changed business tremendously. We've gone through any number of crises with the store pre-internet, of business going up, going down, this happening, that happening. When the internet hit, it was like a sledgehammer. Once Napster got started and people began to believe that music was free, had a tremendous impact on the way we were operating at that time. There are just a lot of different ways to look at it and to look at how people think about music now. There's so much music out there. People used to come to Wax Trax all through the 80s and first part of the 90s just to find out what was new. These days, that information is at your fingertips if you're at the North Pole. It's just a completely different kind of climate.
About what was the population of Denver like in the 80s relative to now? Like, on average, how many people would you see on, say, one side of a city block walking down it?
Oh, I have no idea.
Like none?
Well, the block on 13th between Washington and where we're at here.
Yeah, like right here.
Would would be deserted, except for our customers and a handful of panhandlers and Vietnam vets who had been kicked out of halfway shelters when Fort Logan started to empty out through a lack of funding. These days, there's quite a number of kind of exciting businesses up and down through here. We're sitting in front of Pablo's Coffee, just a couple of blocks from the store. Up there is Corner Market and Jelly's Restaurant, Hudson Hill. So there's quite a number of people just drifting up and down the street going to various merchants and services. So that is considerably different.
Back in the day, Wax Trax was pretty much it along this stretch here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, except for a handful of pretty rough, low-life bars.
Right.
There was, which was an interesting drug clientele as well.
Okay.
Made for some risky stuff.
So if the population is the biggest difference, what are some other noticeable differences? What have you seen come and go over the course of the years in Denver? This name say it too.
I'm not sure what I would name. In terms of the business, I would say there is not as much subgenre identities. We used to enjoy in the store how all the subcultures would be hanging out and hanging in a different area. There'd be kids in denim jackets and bandanas standing in front of the U2 section. There'd be, skinheads standing in front of the hardcore section. There'd be blue-haired grandmas standing in front of our Elvis bootleg section. And today, it's really hard to particularly identify these kinds of subcultures. There's a
homogeneity.
Well, it's a homogeneity, a conformity that is kind of defined by is the same with small differences.
Okay, all right. Question 4, describe the importance of New Wave and punk to Denver's evolution in history.
Well, at least at the beginning, the history of New Wave and punk was pretty much the history of Wax Trax. There probably were some other places that had the music on their shelves, but we were probably the only store that knew what it was and actually listened to it and liked it. The shows that were being put on at a local level were just house parties. There were no venues that were particularly devoted to playing new wave or punk shows, though right across the street up the block where Benny's is and your mom's house was a bar called Malfunction Junction, and local bands did get a chance to play in there, punk bands and that sort of thing. That began to change when the Rainbow Music Hall out of Monaco and Evans started putting on a lot of shows with early new wave bands before new wave was a term of derision. Bands like the Pretenders and Talking Heads and Ramones and Susie and Cure, all those bands played there under label-supported tours, which meant that the label was putting money into it. The tickets were like $3 or $4 a piece. So the idea was get them exposed, get them excited about the music, and get them into a store where they buy the music.
What would you say are like 5 venues that no longer exist that were important like that?
Well, primarily the Rainbow. Rainbow Music Hall.
Rainbow, Malfunction Junction.
Kennedy's Warehouse, which is where a lot of local punk bands, hardcore and punk bands. Wallabies. Geez, I'd forgotten all about Wallabies. Yeah, Wallabies, Straight Johnsons.
The original
the original Mercury. Geez, how can I forget that? The original Mercury, which is just one block away from us, had all the great bands. I mean, X played there, Black Flag played there, the Birthday Party played there, Gun Club, Bad Brains, Dead Kennedys. It was a great place.
How would you describe the musical eras of Denver? If you had to split Denver musical history up into separate eons, where do the separations go?
Wouldn't be much different than the way it was for the country. I mean, definitely starting in the late 70s and going through to the mid and late 80s, a kind of melange of punk, and it morphed into hardcore. But out of punk also came post-punk, which is a little bit more experimental. There was definitely a huge goth population here in Denver, starting in the mid-'80s. That lasted well into the 90s. My wife, who ran our t-shirt and poster store, used to say that she was in business only to support Robert Smith of The Cure. I mean, because she just sold this stuff by the bucket load. And then following that, there was also the rise of out of disco and dance into techno and that sort of thing. And of all things, we did quite a bit of business in that area. But then the reaction against that, you could say in a way, was the coming along of grunge. That kind of was the last big phase of identifiable music for us anyway. Along with grunge, there was just what was called college rock or indie rock or alternative rock, just to say, you know, a band like Pavement. And there was a huge amount of interest in them, despite the fact that they weren't very exciting as performers. I mean, if you look at the difference between a band like Pavement and Einstürzende Neubauten, you know, one is a spectacle, the other is you know, craft on stage.
You'd say grunge is the last, like, really big push.
Yeah.
Most rock aficionados would agree with you there. Would you say that Denver was purely imitative of coastal stuff, or would you say that there was something unique about it? Something identifiably Denver?
Well, what was identifiable in the early days were how rude the audiences were. I mean,
that counts.
I saw some terrible stuff done at the Rainbow, you know, booing and jeering and, you know, just not much patience for the way a band wanted to develop. But in terms of the music influences, as much as I hate to say it, absolutely, it came from the coasts, you know, the different kinds of music. All through the late 80s and early 90s, we actually sold, we were never computerized then, so it's all guesswork, but the amount of import stuff, import titles from England in particular, that we were selling was just huge. There were several distributors that specialized in just imports, and we were just buying and selling like crazy in that. And so the cachet or reputation of English music was just tremendous. And all of that stuff we were getting from these import distributors before they had an American contract. And that also helped us to stand out from the other stores. Other stores would carry a little bit of that, but we had racks of it.
Would you say the English stuff outsold the coastal stuff?
Not sure if it outsold it, though.
It's about even?
At times it probably did.
It varied. Okay. Following the last question, what would you define as the Denver sound? You say there isn't one, but listening to Denver music from the 80s, I do notice a strain that I wouldn't hear in a Los Angeles or a New York song. And while I would argue that the bands of the 80s do generally follow the production trends of the period, and the same is the case today, I hear a lot of groups that tend to follow the production trends of the coasts, but at the same time I could probably identify them as Denver if they were in a lineup. If there is one element of the Denver sound, or one thing you could call the Denver sound, what would you say that is?
I guess it would be kind of an Americana route. I mean, Big Head Todd and the Monsters were huge here. Or a band like the Subdudes back in the 80s were huge with that sort of stuff. Wasn't particularly music that we were identified with, but we did move a lot of it through the store.
Would you say that the Denver sound is defined by a sort of disconnect or neuroticism?
I'm not sure on that. I'm not sure how I would answer that.
Okay.
Not a way I've thought about it.
Wax Trax dealt a lot with punk and new wave from elsewhere.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Do you believe Denver's cultural impact on the national level has decreased over the years, and if so, why?
No, I don't think it's decreased. I don't think it was ever registered on the needle at all. Denver's
Interesting.
influence has not been particularly great. We have always hoped for and wanted some sort of breakout band and or trend that would be identifiably Denver's, like Seattle, like Cleveland, places like that had a local scene that expanded in such a way that it became a national impact. And I don't see Denver even having that, even though there have been, currently Nathaniel Rateliff is hugely popular. Is Billy Strange from Denver?
Nathaniel Rateliff is from Missouri.
But he's here, and I think this is where he put himself into the zeitgeist. He owns the Skylark down here, and it fits with the kind of music that Denver is definitely identified with, the kind of roots music.
How do you believe Denver could improve?
Well, they could pass a law requiring everybody to shop once a month at Wax Trax.
Well, Canada has something like that. Canada subsidizes...
We're not moving to Canada.
What I mean is, Canada has a law that subsidizes local radio such that a certain percentage of music played on the radio has to be Canadian. That way the Canadian identity remains strong. So it's lots of Rush and Steppenwolf and that.
We could call it Denver identity.
Would you say that Denver developing a more stable population could improve its musical output? That is to say, a population who remains long enough to sort of understand it and see it for what it is and,
That's a
figure it
tricky
out?
question, because it's sometimes the mix of disparate elements coming together that sparks into something that's interesting. I mean, in the 80s, when we first began to see an explosion of local bands that would all come through the store, and many of whom we were friends with, as the Glue-Ons and that sort of thing. Those were all bands of people who came from everywhere. Would it improve it if all of those people stuck around? Maybe. But ideally, I think you do look forward to other people coming into the area and kind of bringing a sensibility that might not be the first thing you think of here in Denver.
Would you say that Denver's population was more stable in the 80s and that people stuck around for longer periods of time, even if they weren't from here?
Stable neurotically?
No, just stable population-wise.
I know. I'm just kidding. I moved to Denver in 1972, and my wife and I were always surprised at how many people we met on the street that we knew from our hometowns in Illinois. I think Denver's population has been pretty mobile and changeable for an awful long time. I would say from at least the height of the hippie era in the 66, 67, 68, the amount of people coming to Denver was staggering. I was also out here in the 60s because I was in the Army out here at Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and would see what was going on downtown with the crowds and the art scene and the music scene. It was smaller, but it was still in flux.
That was sort of the hippie music era was before your time. Groups like Sugarloaf, Jerry Corbetta. That's a big one.
Well, not before my time, but I was not here. It was back in Illinois.
You weren't in touch with it as much.
When Sugarloaf was big, yeah.
Okay. So you'd say that generally Denver's strength is and always has been its diversity and its ability to mold sounds from around the continent. That its central position is a major strength of it.
Excellent way to put it. I agree with that totally.
All right. Well, I agree with that. Okay. How does Denver as an environment affect its music? So this is where the neuroticism comes in. If there's
you're kind of right there. Having known an awful lot of young people who've been in bands and encountered huge amounts of frustration about how to be a performing artist and make a living, they have found that Denver is a very, very tough place. Break through the ceiling and achieve a kind of success in that. If you're familiar with a grunge band called The Fluid.
Yes, my mother was had a big crush on Ricky Kulwicki. Yes.
Okay. Well, they're an instructive story about how a band that did break out of Denver yet could not achieve the kind of success that allowed them to reach a level where they stayed together. And I think at an even lower level, a lot of the young, small bands that I've known for decades who have come and gone, they were guys and gals with great ideas, lots of ambition, but Denver was not a place they could push into anything. A lot of those folks decamped and went to New York and to LA. Sadly, I don't think too many of them even did much there, but there were more doors to open there than there were here.
Fluid is an interesting case in that they were grunge but predated Nirvana. Well, grunge does predate Nirvana. Neil Young is often defined as grunge. But they saw very little recognition on a national level. Would you say that a Denver group should stick with Denver, or would you say that going the national route and touring and the like is a recipe for success, or would you say that a Denver group might achieve more success by sticking with the local crowd, and it's a smaller crowd, but it's reliable and it's always there?
That's a hard question for me to answer. I'm not in that end of the business. And it depends upon how those individual bands are going to define what a success is, I guess. There are bands that have played and played and played. They've kept day jobs. They managed to get out on the road. Well, The Fluid, Matt Bishop is I knew him when he was in a band called The Frantics. And in the early 80s, I put out singles by them through the Wax Trax label. He was involved in The Fluid. Here in the last 10, 15 years, he was in Buckingham Squares with Ricky Kulwicki. And unfortunately, Ricky died. Buckingham Squares kind of morphed into Cyclosonic, and Matt's still out there playing, but he's never not had a day job. Ricky Kulwicki, in my mind, one of the great guitar players, and as a performer, he was hypnotic. He was mesmerizing. He had all the rock moves and stuff, and from the Fluid, then back down to the Buckingham Squares and that sort of thing. He also had a day job that he was never able to get rid of.
In your estimation, would you say that despite being perpetually trapped in languid obscurity, Ricky Kulwicki was a success in that he was a good, talented musician and immensely competent?
He was an absolute success. He enjoyed the music he made, and whether there were, 10 people in front of him or 2,000, he gave everything that he could. And him many times, and yes, he loved the Fluid process. He loved being able to go to Europe and tour. Ricky almost defines rock and roll to me. He was a great guy and a great performer.
Even though being a musician in Denver can at times seem like a futile and Sisyphean task, would you say that real success comes from just maintaining confidence and enjoying what you've got?
Yes.
What are 10 classic Denver bands everyone should listen to? The staples of the canon.
Well, the Frantics and the Fluid. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, old and new. I mean, old. I mean, Tommy Bolin. Was great.
The Gluons, right?
The Gluons. Yes, the Gluons.
You would recommend the Gluons?
I mean, there were a number of bands, particularly in the '80s, that you'd be hard pressed to find, but that I liked a lot. Bumcon for just straight ahead punk, edging into hardcore. Your Funeral was a great band, kind of gothy. The Young Weasels.
Right.
Were a good new wave / post-punk band. Gosh. Lunch. Not quite Denver, but Colorado bands, the Kamikaze Clones, and bands like that. Warlock Pinchers, who still have a big reputation in kind of avant-garde circles. So there were Crank Call, Love Affair.
Crank Call, okay.
Yeah. What's that? Aviators, yeah.
Aviators sound like Denver. That's a good suggestion.
And they were.
All right. Is the music circuit in Denver better for artists today, or was it better in the past? That is, was it easier to be a musician in Denver in the past or now?
Probably easier now because there's more places to play. Particularly in the early '80s, when a place like Wallabies down on Broadway started allowing new wave bands in, it was so exciting. But even then, a big crowd at Wallabies would be 50 people, right? I mean,
maybe. A few in there.
Yeah.
Most shows still only have 50 people.
Well, certainly for a local level, getting 50 may even be a stretch. Unless you're, I can't remember the name of the band, the Velveteers or something like that.
That's an interesting answer, because I would argue that market oversaturation tends to make people take local music more for granted. For instance, I was at a show the other night where a local band was put at the end of the lineup after like 3 touring bands. But,
yeah, tough place.
But would you say that music is generally more accessible now, and it's easier to look up bands and figure out what they're up to?
The internet makes all of this information right at your fingertips.
Yeah. So, good news and bad news, I guess.
Yeah.
Why do people create art in an environment that won't even remember them? What is the...
Because they're driven to express something that they've got inside of them. The process of making art is a bedrock function of being a human being. And that doesn't matter whether you're making music or writing books or painting, whatever.
Ultimately, all art will be forgotten, even like the Mona Lisa.
Well,
in the far future, yeah.
Eventually,
right.
The Earth will be a cinder. So.
Right. Would you say that people sometimes tend to forget that? Would you say that the key to creating successful art is to remember that it's ultimately futile?
No, I would say that
expression?
the important thing about the making of the art is what it does to the person who is making the art.
In the immediate present and on a psychological level.
In the act of doing it.
Not to worry too much about the future or like a big legacy, but just to focus on just to focus on the here and now.
By the time you get to the point where you're going to start worrying about your legacy, you've already gone through several stages of the creative process.
Is Denver particularly conducive to New Wave, and if so, why? Like, would you say that you saw more New Wave here than on the coasts back in the 80s?
I wouldn't say you saw more, though if you put it in proportional terms rather than absolute terms, Denver certainly adopted New Wave music pretty strongly. But New Wave is kind of a flexible term, and there was a turn even by the early 80s where New Wave, because of the way the labels adopted it as a marketing tool, was becoming a term of derision.
Well, the same thing happened with disco.
Oh, absolutely.
Although New Wave disco got a revival recently, and New Wave hasn't.
New Wave has never gone away. Is the problem?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Depeche Mode just had a show that was I don't know if it was sold out, but there were thousands of people there, a number of whom I've talked to, and they were very excited about it. And
New Wave is still around, but nobody really notices it.
Well, I think they notice it.
They just don't know what to call it. These days it tends to get called alt a lot.
From the distance of several decades, when you go back and play some of the New Wave, Duran Duran or Romeo Void, Strange Advance, any number of bands from back then, and what you hear is basically radio-friendly pop music, and that certainly has not died. An attention to craft and a desire to make your audience take notice and get excited, that's still one of the major driving forces of music.
The New Wave's legacy is carried on most in pop, you'd say?
Yes.
Was there more New Wave or punk in the 80s? Or about even?
Yeah, that'd be hard to say.
There's a lot of overlap. Would you say that Denver New Wave is sort of reactionary to the more rootsy Americana stuff you mentioned? Or would you say it works in tandem with it, and that Denver New Wave has kind of a fusion hybrid of rootsy and more coastal sensibilities?
Right from the get-go, there were a number of subgenres, and you would, I think you're right in putting them kind of in the same stream. A local band like Lunch, which you could consider New Wave, also had strong identity with a kind of rockabilly and 50s rock and roll
yes, I noticed
sound.
That.
The idea of punk as a theory was to go back to the roots of a rock and roll sound and clean it up, get rid of, all of the extraneous stuff. The difference between Yes and Chicago and a band like the Talking Heads at first blush seems huge, and those in Denver, the desire was to be closer to a kind of purity of rock and roll.
So you'd say Denver New Wave and punk wasn't so much a response to ritzy Americana, but more so to prog rock and the like.
Oh, I think a lot of punk rock had to do with prog rock, and at the other end of it, the Eagles and James Taylor. The singer-songwriter.
What today is considered yacht rock.
Yacht rock.
What gives you hope in regards to Denver's future? That is, what do you see on a local scale that makes you go, there could be something here?
Well, again, there's all kinds of people coming into Denver, and they bring an excitement and enthusiasm along with them. They form bands that get together and fall apart within weeks. They continue this excitement. The amount of kind of DIY spaces that are around, there's a constant churn of those, I think is ample reason for hope that the music will continue to be exciting and interesting, and that we'll be reaching out to try to pull people in.
Would you say that Denver should put more stock into its DIY venues rather than its more commercial venues?
Well, that's a tricky question. The good DIY venues probably are hoping to become, low tier and mid tier performing spaces. The difference between Rhinoceropolis and the High Dive is a matter of professionalism and licensing and what the commercial goal may or may not be.
It's a matter of scale.
And it's a matter of scale.
Okay. This is an interesting question. What are 10 modern Denver acts you would recommend? So in terms of acts you've seen in the last 5-10 years or so that you think have a lot of potential?
Well, Churchfire is probably number one on my list. Just an absolutely great band. Personal favorite of mine, how far they'll be able to go, is also a band, Jukebox Hard Knocks, which is just a wonderful straight-ahead country band done by guys who also, as a side project, have kind of misfits / hardcore band called America's Most Haunted. There's Julian Street Nightmare, a guy down in Colorado Springs, just called Tensas, Tensas, who's a kind of a Tom Waits / Dave Van Ronk kind of performer who writes some great country goth types of songs.
Have you heard of Itch.io?
Oh yeah, Itch.io is a great band.
Itch.io gets big.
If you're going to get to that level, then Slim Cessna and Andy Monley, and there are some Slim Cessna offshoots, Woven Hand, those kinds of bands. Geez, they are great bands. But like Slim and Itch.io, they already have a national level of audience, which is great.
When was the moment you realized that Denver had potential? That is, when's the exact moment you thought something could be made out of this?
I'm not sure I could say the exact moment, but it would have been one of the nights when I was out seeing. Well, no, we'll pick one night. The first annual Wax Trax Crash Party, where Wax Trax a car had run through our building in January or February of 1979, and a year later we had a party to celebrate that we survived it, and we had a number of bands playing there, including Mike Chappelle's Glue-Ons, the Jetsons, the Young Weasels, Leroy X, and the Defects. There were about 5 bands, and there was a pretty good spectrum of band sounds with that. They were awesome. They were really good, and they were very, very fun and exciting bands. There were a lot of people there careening around in half-ass mosh pits and dancing, back when dancing was just basically running in place. Stayed friends with some of those people over the years, and they really believed in the music and in themselves, and it was a wonderful time.
It was 1979. Would you say that 1979 is an important year in Denver music history, a veritable turning point?
Well, 79, actually it would have to go 79 through the early 80s. There was a lot happening, but at the time, it definitely didn't seem like you were being overwhelmed with stuff happening. Day to day,
It felt manageable?
Oh yeah, very definitely.
You'd say like 79 to 83, 84 is a very important era.
Yeah, great time for not just music in Denver, but music everywhere. Well, at least America and Europe.
Would you say that if Denverites knew more about the history of Denver music, they might be able to form more of a cohesive identity and sound?
It's possible.
If they understood their forebears, because all too often I hear people who get here and think that, there's no culture here, nothing is happening here. How does that work? They just have to look for it, and if they don't look for it, then they won't find it.
Yeah. I don't think it's a requirement for a new band to know anything about the Denver scene. I do think it's a requirement that they know something about the roots of the music that they're most interested in performing. That's a tricky question that has to do with, most rock and roll is built out of pieces of conventional music. The way it's put together and the sensibility that a band or an artist can bring to it is what can make it snap together in such a way that it, when you hear it, it kind of explodes in your head and your heart.
Would you say that if someone wants to make a Denver-type song, they should listen to Denver-type music?
Well, I don't know.
Going by what you said, that if a band wants to, if they want to be like a goth band, they should listen to a lot of goth music. If someone wants to be a Denver band, should they listen to a lot of Denver music?
I don't see Denver as having that strong of an identity, so I'm not sure how I would answer that.
Would you say that if Denver recognized its history more, it would have a stronger identity? That could be a potential factor?
Well, it could be. I mean, I certainly would be in favor of people knowing more about the history of local music in Denver. It had some pretty exciting phases and stuff, and there's undoubtedly all kinds of things that have happened and have kind of faded into the night.
Question 18. How do you hope history will remember you? Going off that sentiment.
Well, I don't think they'll remember me. I hope that they remember Wax Trax as a kind of exciting and fun cultural hub for just music, but for the people who came through the store. And that would include both the folks who were out on the floor looking to buy something and the seemingly hundreds of kids that I've hired over the years who have gone on to do all kinds of things. And with 45 years behind us, I think if Wax Trax disappeared tomorrow, it would leave a bit of a hole in Denver culture. Not that, as you were pointing out earlier, everything fades away at some point. We're going strong, but who knows what the future brings.
You are glad that it's been 45 years, and that's a rare achievement in Denver.
Certainly for
that
record
level of
stores.
stability. Right.
Yes. Yeah, and probably for a lot of businesses, it's a remarkable stretch of time.
Especially for a record store,
Yes.
would you say? Okay. Question 19. What advice would you have for any aspiring groups in the Denver scene today? How would you recommend, if a band is to start out, they go about it? What would you say are the tips to success?
Well, I would say that the first and most important thing is to take care of your band members. If you make the decision that you're going to form a band, to try to find the best ways of dealing with the interpersonal band conflicts. Bands come and go, and they come and go so quickly that it can be very discouraging. I think I mentioned a little while ago that Wax Trax had a record label. One of the reasons I stopped by the late 80s, even bothering to put anything out, was I had done a couple of releases where the bands had broken apart before I got the records back from the recording plant.
Would you say that bands were more stable back then or less stable? How long, on average, did they last?
They are unstable now, and they were unstable then.
Equally?
Yes.
So would you say that instability is, in and of itself, a factor of Denver's stability? In a roundabout sort of way? Okay, so personal chemistry, ideally members of a band should be able to get along with each other and work through differences and the like.
Try to accommodate what the different musical vision is from member to member and what their contribution is. And they're just mechanical, just basic stuff like, you've got to practice. You've got to play out as much as you can. You have to know who your audience is. And this is something Denver bands and a lot of bands in general do, which is take care of your audience. You interact with them, you recognize that they're there giving their time and hopefully some of their money to you, and that you appreciate it. There's and believe me, I'm not saying that bands don't do that, because by and large they know which side their bread is buttered on, and they want to take care of that. But it's important to do that. There's also a thing, and this is not a Denver thing, but I have heard this over and over. Duane, I want to be big in rock and roll, but I don't want to do any promotion. I want it to just happen to me. And there are, I'm sure there are examples of people who they're just so darn good, or they're in the right place at the right time, and that's exactly the way it happens. But
it takes a lot of luck.
It takes an awful lot of luck, and there's an awful lot of good music that goes to the wayside because of the attitude. I'm an artist, and everybody should know it.
It's important to stay humble and respect your audience is where your success comes from.
And to get out there and do the work. If it requires, it requires touring, it requires, working with people who write about music, about, people on radio stations who play it, working with distributors who you try to convince to carry your album or single. Putting yourself out there.
Earlier you mentioned disparity between musical sensibilities of band members. Like one might be more into punk, one might be more into indie, one might be more into alt or country or whatever. Like, for instance, I would have a very difficult time getting with most Denver bands because most of them are like into Nathaniel Rateliff and stuff, and I don't like Nathaniel Rateliff, to be upfront. But would you say that's more of a thing in Denver than elsewhere? That in other cities, like, for instance, if you're from somewhere like Seattle, it's easier to find people with similar taste in music to you?
I don't know, because I do know people who have moved, particularly, oddly enough, to Seattle and Portland, who talk about how difficult it is to find people to play with. So part of the problem here, of course, is that I'm not in those other places, so I don't really know. But even based on that little bit of feedback I've gotten from people I do know who've moved to those areas, I'm not sure. It could be a personality thing. It could be even part of the city you move to as to whether or not you're going to, come across the people who you want to link up with and who want to link up with you.
Could you say, as you mentioned before, the breakdown of subcultures, that back in the day, if you were a punk, all the punks would come to your show. If you were a goth, all the goths would go to your show. Whereas these days, people tend to diversify their taste quite a bit more.
They do diversify it a lot. And I think there is a kind of acceptance of music. Since the COVID lockdown, I've kind of stopped going out to shows, not because I'm worried about the COVID anymore, but because I'm just too damn old. But in the 2 or 3 years leading up to that, say 2019, 2018, 2019, I was going out to a lot of local shows, and I saw a lot of different music, and I saw a lot of the same people at all of those shows. Now, it would be a different mix. I mean, everybody has different friends, different fans, and on any given night, who knows who is able to even come out and stuff. But I definitely saw that there was a wide range of people who just wanted to be at the independent local band's performance. Certainly in the 80s, there was a pretty serious subculture breakdown, and I would say that, you know, skinhead bands, hardcore bands, they had a particular audience, and nobody else came to it. Not cut and dried, obviously. I mean, there was always a mix of some kind. Whereas if I went to the Mercury and saw, you know, Rain Parade played there, one of the great neo-psychedelic bands from California, underground Paisley band of the mid-'80s. It was kind of neo-hippie heaven. It was great fun, but there were no hardcore people there.
Would you say that this diversification of taste is something good for Denver going forward? Like, for instance, someone like myself who's into hard kicking rock and roll and not so much into the Nathaniel Rateliff stuff could benefit greatly by going to see a Nathaniel Rateliff show. And likewise, Nathaniel Rateliff could benefit by working some more rock and roll type stuff into his routine. Sort of a compromise between artist and audience.
Well,
or do you think genre separation is more beneficial?
I think genre identification is fine. Genre separation, ghettoizing music, is not good. Part of it is when you're being serious and when you're being humorous. In the store, I can have dozens of conversations a day in which I make fun of somebody's music. I mean, that's just the way Wax Trax is, right? Yeah. But if you turn the switch and it has to get serious, then it's a completely different matter. Recognizing someone's appreciation of a music that you don't appreciate requires a bit of tact and courtesy.
So you'd say that Denver could become more musically successful by displaying tact and courtesy when appropriate, but also having a decent amount of humor about itself, and finding a balance between the two.
I don't know if it could become successful. It's something I would recommend because I do it. You know, I think I do it anyway.
Well, your formula for success is one that I trust, so. Okay. Question 20. Any final thoughts? Any parting sentiments for the viewing audience?
Well, the parting thing would be to go back to why do people make music?
Very pertinent.
Larger, why do they make art? And I think that respecting people's need to make art and how it expresses something that's going on within them and the way that relates to the environment is absolutely essential to any kind of culture. And whether I like the particular piece of art or the expression is somewhat immaterial. It's fun to do the argument, but the important thing is that all of these people are out there doing something that they're putting a piece of their life into, and I'm all for that.
That time and effort should be respected.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's Duane Davis, Wax Trax extraordinaire here at Pablo's Cafe on 13th. But would you recommend the Denverite shop at Wax Trax?
Yes, I would.
Good record store, good selection?
Good record store, good selection, nice people, good place to be.
All right.